Hello and welcome everyone to this webinar discussing the transparency of environmental assessments in Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm Noah Arshinoff, the Interim Executive Director of TI Canada, that's Transparency International Canada, and we're really pleased to be able to put on this webinar and look forward to your participation today. So TI Canada is Canada's leading anti-corruption organization. We're the Canadian chapter of the Global Transparency International movement that has chapters working in more than 100 countries around the world and providing an unparalleled global understanding and expertise of corruption challenges. Now, the report that we'll be discussing today is a product of TI Canada's Accountable Mining Project. We have similarly released reports looking at the transparency of various processes in other jurisdictions such as Ontario, British Columbia, and Yukon. But with thanks to the Trache Family Foundation, we were able to then do a deeper dive into Newfoundland and Labrador and look at how the environmental assessment process has been applied to several natural resource projects in the province. So I will just inform participants that the webinar is being recorded. Questions, if you have any, can be typed into the chat function, and we'll do our best to answer them as we go along. So let's get to it. We have a great lineup of knowledgeable speakers who you see on your screen. And so I'll just start with a brief introduction. We have Dr. Cole Atlin. She's the Environmental Impact Assessments and Engagement Specialist at Calian Nuclear and an adjunct professor at the University of Waterloo. We have Dr. Mark Stoddart, professor in the Department of Sociology at Memorial University with research interests in environmental sustainability. We have Dr. Sarah Seck, associate professor, the Yogis Kennedy Chair in Human Rights Law and director of the Marine and Environmental Law Institute at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University. And we have Simon Popescu. Simon is completing a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning at Queen's University and has a specific research interest in environmental assessments. I should mention that Simon was one of the primary authors of this report. And finally, moderating the session, we have Boyan First, the manager of knowledge mobilization at the Leslie Harris Center of Regional Policy and Development at Memorial University of Newfoundland. So with that, I will hand it over to Boyan.
Thank you, Noah. Welcome, everybody. We are going to try to cover as much as we can. And throughout the discussions, I will ask Noah if there are any questions from the audience, so that I have some questions, but we can also add yours as well, so that we can answer as many questions as possible. And just want to emphasize that while the report is about the transparency of the environmental assessment process in Newfoundland and Labrador, we are really interested in the process and what it means, not just in Newfoundland and Labrador, but everywhere. So with that in mind, I would like to start with a question for Simon, and maybe we can spend a little bit of time clearing up some definitions. And what I'm asking about here is, given the legislative and regulatory framework that we have, how is this supposed to work? So we are not looking for what could be better and what's not working, but like ideally, how is this supposed to work given what we have? So Simon, what is environmental assessment process?
Sure, yeah. So for people who aren't as familiar, broadly, environmental assessment is kind of in Canada, is a legislated process at both the provincial and the federal level. And its main kind of idea is to evaluate and mitigate the environmental and social impacts of potential undertakings. And the reason why that happens is because it's supposed to, its purpose or its intention is to aid decision makers in planning proposed developments, kind of with the overall goal of ensuring that those developments are developed in a sustainable manner. And again, that occurs by evaluating sort of the likelihood and significance of potential impacts from a project, sort of the effectiveness of potential mitigation measures to address those impacts. And then if there's any likelihood or if there's any presence of likely and sort of significant residual effects that might stick around after mitigation measures have been applied. So kind of all of that is to kind of just help decision making on proposed developments. And it can be applied to a lot of different types of developments, from resource development or forestry or roads and bridges and things like that. So it all depends on the legislation of what each provincial or the federal legislation covers, but that's broadly what the EA process is supposed to do.
Okay, thank you for that. But that process doesn't exist in vacuum, right? It's tied into a whole bunch of other things. So maybe I'll throw the question to Sarah, but all of you on the panel, feel free to wave your hand and jump in on any of the questions. Sarah, how does it fit? How does the process, the EA process, fit with the broader environmental regulatory context in Canada, but also, in other jurisdictions?
Right. So I think what's important to keep in mind is the history of EA and its role in this broader landscape. So if we think back to 1992, for example, in the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, it identifies environmental assessment as a national tool that all governments should have in place as part of their planning process. And I think we find now that it's very clearly understood that every government decision should be going through this environmental assessment process, that it can apply in relation to projects that are planned, but also there are other kinds. So strategic environmental assessment and also regional assessment is another example. But that's not the only thing that the Rio Declaration says that states should have. They're also supposed to have other regulatory processes. So even if you go through your environmental assessment and go through that, there's still going to be other environmental regulatory tools, statutes that companies need to comply with, and that's obviously part of the bigger picture. But I did also want to note that that's the idea of sort of environmental assessment as being focused on biophysical, so the environmental dimensions, was its really early stage. And since that time, 1992, there's been a huge evolution in the international context, and we're seeing this increasingly in the domestic context with the federal legislation, I think is a good example of expanding beyond the focus on biophysical to include social. And that includes, of course, respect for Indigenous governance, and how does that play in particular post the 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Attention, again, we see in the federal legislation to the idea of gender-based analysis plus, but more broadly to really important questions about the relationship between environment and human rights. So when I'm teaching environmental law, I'm referring in part to how do we think holistically about the procedural dimension of environmental rights. And this is particularly salient now that we have a UN General Assembly resolution recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So I'm happy to speak to sort of that broader context, but I think EA should be understood as a piece of the procedural environmental rights landscape that is necessary to realize substantive environmental protections.
We have time. Would you mind just a little bit expanding on that broader context? Because that is fascinating, that part where we kind of moved beyond biophysical into social and cultural, right?
So I'm increasingly using the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a holistic framework for thinking about environmental issues. So substantively, this would include rights to clean air, clean water, safe places so non-toxic places to live, work, and play is an expression, resilient ecosystems and biodiversity, safe and sustainable food systems, and I feel like I forgot one, which is a safe climate, very important. So substantively, that's what we're all looking for, but how do you get there? Procedurally, this requires individuals and groups to have access to information about potential environmental harms, to be able to engage in freedom of expression and freedom of association so they can raise their concerns, rights to education over environmental issues, public participation in environmental decision-making, access to justice in cases of environmental harms, and importantly, a safe space for environmental human rights defenders to raise their concerns about potential impacts. And then there's cross-cutting attention to non-discrimination and vulnerability, so that certain groups need particular attention, and this draws into focus histories of colonialism and discrimination that have sort of rendered some people more vulnerable and make it harder for them to exercise their rights. But that's my broad framework. There's a lot of stuff in that, and EA is part of it. So prior assessment is crucial, but access to information is crucial too. And the ability to participate effectively is going to be different for different people.
So that's where this notion of transparency and the importance of transparency of the process comes into play, right?
Absolutely. It's absolutely essential.
Okay. So we kind of have a little bit of a broader picture, and now we have to bring it back to a smaller jurisdiction like Newfoundland and Labrador. So how does that, and maybe Simon and Sarah, whoever wants to, or Mark and Cole, how does that process work in Newfoundland and Labrador?
Yeah, I can start off. So the EA process in Newfoundland and Labrador is is demarcated by 5 main stages. So that's registration and review, the minister's initial decision on how to proceed with an EA, then the preparation of guidelines for either what's called an environmental preview report, or EPR, or an environmental impact statement, or EIS. And then the proponent prepares that EPR or EIS, and then the minister then reviews the EPR or EIS and issues a final decision. So I can go a little bit more detail. So registration and review is pretty similar to a screening phase in most EA processes and other provincial and federal jurisdictions. And like a screening phase, under Newfoundland and Labrador's regulations, there are certain undertakings that automatically trigger an environmental assessment process. So things like petroleum and coal projects, or oil and gas, mining and forestry, sort of those types of undertakings. And then the proponent submits a project description outlining what the potential environmental impacts could be from that undertaking. And then using that project description, the province's EA department reviews it, as well as public comments on the project description, and then provides a recommendation as to whether that project should undergo an EPR, so environmental preview report, or an environmental impact statement. They can also at that stage recommend that the project proceed without conditions, so it gets approved right away. But ultimately, the minister is the one who makes that decision about how the project will proceed. And so, yeah, the minister can approve without conditions, approve with conditions, require an EPR, or require an EIS. And so, sorry. Yeah, under both an EPR and an EIS, the minister is required to select an EA committee, which kind of runs the bulk of the assessment work. So they set the guidelines, which inform the proponent about how they should be proceeding with the environmental assessment. And so that's used to help complete the environmental assessment work as part of the process. So the proponent goes through that and prepares their EPR or EIS report. And during an EPR, the proponent may be required to develop a public participation plan, but it's not a requirement. However, under an EIS, that's always a requirement. And so once the proponent completes their EPR or EIS, it's reviewed by the Environmental Assessment Committee to ensure compliance with their kind of final report with the guidelines that have already been established. And so after that review, the EA committee provides the recommendations to the minister, who then has to make another decision about whether to approve the project with or without conditions. But at that point, if it's been an EPR process, the minister can also require the proponent to undergo an EIS process, which is the higher kind of standard of assessment with a bit more longer timelines and a bit more rigor. However, the proponent can also voluntarily undergo an EIS process at any point. And if an EIS process has been happening up to this time, it's actually the cabinet, not the minister, who becomes responsible for the project approval. And so there's also a provision that if even after an EIS, the minister still doesn't feel that they can make a decision whether about the significance of the potential impacts, whether that's kind of deficiency in the reports or significant public concern still remains. The minister has two potential avenues they can use, which is requesting a public hearing, which requires cabinet approval and the appointment of another board, or requiring the proponent to submit component studies on specific parts of the EA that they feel that they don't quite understand or haven't demonstrated the significance of potential impacts. And so if a public hearing happens, that requires cabinet approval and the appointment of a board. And that board is responsible for undertaking the hearings, compiling public comments and proponent responses, and then submits a final report with recommendations to the minister. And then the minister reviews that and provides their recommendations to cabinet on whether they should release the project with conditions or deny it. So that's kind of a very long explanation about all the intricacies, but I think it's kind of important to know where the different avenues are in that process, because there's a lot of layers in how any project can kind of go in any direction. So yeah.
Everybody else on the panel, anything you would like to add? You're good.
I'll just add one comment, which is to say, I think that's a very comprehensive overview. Well done. And I think the report does a nice job of laying that out. I did want to draw to the attention of anybody who isn't aware, there is an organization called East Coast Environmental Law, which is an environmental NGO that's based in the Atlantic region. And they have also posted lots of materials specifically on environmental assessment in Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as comparable regimes in other provinces. So it can be a good source to go to for additional information.
Thank you. Noah, do we have any questions online?
Not yet that I see, but I will encourage participants again. If you do have questions, please type them into the chat.
Okay. Because I'm nosy and I like imagining different scenarios, here is what happens if we have a project that straddles provincial borders. Who gets to be responsible for conducting environmental assessment and under whose rules? Can anybody answer that?
There's a couple of rules there, but mainly, you know, that if you're overcrossing provincial borders, you'll trigger a federal impact assessment.
Okay.
And then you would still be required to meet both the impact assessment or environmental assessment components of both provinces. Likely under the new assessment regime, it would be all integrated into one, hopefully, assessment that proponents could then meet the standards of all three regimes likely, or potentially 4 or 5 if they're a nuclear project or an oil and gas project and they have other governing regulatory bodies. As Sarah said, EA and IA is just one element.
Okay.
I had a brilliant point. It's lost now. No.
Sorry, keep going.
Yeah. No. So there are multiple regulatory regimes on any project. So there is the EA IA lens, but there's also, like in a nuclear project, for example, they have regulatory requirements created from the CNSC. So all of those documents generally kind of get integrated into this one decision window, which is the EA IA moment. But if it does cross borders, that creates specific challenges. There's other kind of triggers as well, which would to trigger a federal impact assessment.
Thank you.
No problem.
Perfect. I see that Elaine Harris has a hand up. Here's what we're going to do. If you want to ask a question, keep your hand up and we'll get to you to all the verbal questions at the end. If it's a question that you can type it up, and we'll try to slot it in as we go through our conversation. We do have a lot of material that I want to cover, but keep your questions in mind. So, one of the things I really appreciated about the report, that it was really interesting because it had 3 mini case studies that looked at very specific examples of how this works. So let's start with one that everybody loves talking about in Newfoundland and Labrador. Mark, Muskrat Falls. How does Newfoundland move forward from this?
Well, maybe I'll just start with a brief intro, just in case people don't know the case. I'm not going to assume everybody online is familiar. So Muskrat Falls is a mega hydro project on the lower Churchill River in Labrador, the Labrador portion of the province. It kind of came online through the 2000s. Originally, it was pitched largely as a form of economic development and economic and energy self-sufficiency that would kind of be a sort of compensation for the perceived inequities of the deal with Quebec on the upper Churchill River development of the late 1960s and early 70s, where I think there's a lot of long-standing antipathy to the deal with Quebec dating back to then. So it went through its various processes, approvals and processes, including impact assessment, including review from the Public Utilities Board, largely in a time of a lot of kind of boosterism and optimism under the Danny Williams premiership, very charismatic premier. And since then, I mean, it's, with more reflection about the project, it's become more and more problematic. I think a case study of a mega project gone very wrong in terms of being billions of dollars over budget. I think over double the initial estimates. The initial estimates were around 6 billion. It's now over 13 billion, years over schedule. It generated a lot of mobilization and opposition by community members in Labrador, including Nunatsiavut and Innu Nation community members who mobilized as Labrador land protectors, the river keepers, Labrador, and also a lot of opposition and critique from within St. John's as well. So it's been proven to be, a bit of a financial debacle, has raised significant concerns about the quality of Indigenous engagement and downstream impacts, environmental justice impacts downstream, and all that kind of stuff. So, it's interesting because I think the public inquiry that's since been done has referred to Muskrat Falls as a debacle. And I think there were certainly, as this report makes clear, the TI report makes clear, issues that could have been improved with the impact assessment, especially around Indigenous engagement and transparency and so on. That there was a lot of informal communication, a lot of stuff that wasn't as transparent as it should have been. However, in the work I've done with Cole, the project we ran a couple of years ago, I think Cole's, and Cole can correct me if I'm wrong, but that overall the impact assessment wasn't the worst part of this process. It actually did what it was supposed to do in terms of raising red flags, serving as a checkpoint of reflexivity to raise concerns. Same with the Public Utilities Board committee hearing. So the real issues then became a lack of efficacy in terms of having the impact assessment process actually make meaningful change to the project, or to actually go from identifying these red flags to saying, hey, we need to do something differently. We need to slow down. We need to rethink this project. So the major issues in the Muskrat Falls case were, I think, more around the translation of the impact assessment process into policy and practice. It was that decision makers had bought into the project. And then when the Liberal government kind of took over from the Conservatives, they kind of largely changed the discourse to, well, we've inherited this project. We're kind of into, sunk cost fallacy. We're in too late now. We're in too deep to really stop or pull back without incurring substantially more costs. And, you saw the discourse change a little bit around, Muskrat Falls as a climate solution, kind of that got raised more and more. But I think there was this real reluctance to to take those red flags raised by both the impact assessment and the Public Utility Board seriously, to the point where it might actually impact the timelines of the project, the design of the project. So I think in terms of moving forward, there's a lot of lessons to learn that are flagged in this report around how to do more meaningful community engagement, particularly with Indigenous communities, but also, some of the issues around the very often personalistic and informal culture of politics in Newfoundland and Labrador, and those problems that were flagged, that a lot of things were done, on handshakes and phone calls, not in a transparent way, right? So a lot of lessons I think that we can take moving forward. And as there is still future hydro development people have in mind for the lower Churchill River. Gull Island kind of keeps getting raised as a possibility, not officially moving forward at this point, but it kind of stays in the ether in the political sphere. So I think if we don't learn the lessons from Muskrat Falls, Gull Island, if it does move forward, is very much destined to be a case of there was no mistake so bad we can't make it again a few years later. Right. And lest we think that Muskrat Falls is unique to Newfoundland and Labrador, I think it would also say that, I think there's also a conversation I had with Cole during this project. We could have written almost virtually the same report about Site C in British Columbia, for example. And you could probably write a very similar report about the O train in Ottawa, for example, to take another mega project we could pick on that's maybe had some similar issues. So I think this is also a case where we want to not use Muskrat Falls as a case to bash Newfoundland and Labrador, but say that some of these issues are recurring themes, right? Right. Yeah.
What I find particularly interesting is that the environmental assessment process sits in the middle of all these other moving parts that even if you run the process relatively well, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will come to a decision in agreement with the results of that process.
And this is, a good point to always remember when we talk about public engagement of any kind in the context of transparency and good governance, is there's a big difference between having your voice, having an opportunity to speak your voice versus how seriously political efficacy of that voice, right? Or how seriously decision makers take it. And I think that's a really, when we think about the quality of engagement or how meaningful engagement is, that's extremely important, that there is the opportunity side, but then there's also the how does the efficacy play out in how seriously it's taken by decision makers. Yeah.
Anybody on the panel, would you like to jump in and say something?
I wanted to note a couple of things. First of all, it's important to remember that project actually went through the federal process, but the federal process at the time was a different legislative regime than the one that's in place right now. Which is to note that, it could have gone exactly the same way under the current regime, or it might not have, because of course these things change quite a bit. But the other thing to note is, one of the things that I had sort of noted at the time I was living in Ontario, I'm originally from St. John's, Newfoundland. I'm now in Halifax, but I pay attention to stuff going on in Newfoundland and Labrador. One of the things that raised a red flag for me was seeing that there was a lawsuit brought by the premier against an individual who'd been raising concerns over Muskrat Falls. Now, I don't know the details of that, but there's this thing known as SLAP litigation, which is described as strategic litigation against public participation. And there are some provinces in Canada that have what's known as anti-SLAP legislation, which allows somebody who's being sued by this to go to court and get it dismissed, saying this isn't a real lawsuit, this is designed to get me to stop speaking in the public about this project. So I just wanted to flag that because I think it's not noted in the report as another potential sort of legal mechanism that could be put in place. I think maybe all provinces should think about having anti-SLAP legislation in place, but also there are questions as to how it works, and so concerns over where it is in place that it may not be working the way it's supposed to. But the key is governments and everybody have governments and businesses have a responsibility to help those who are concerned about projects to raise their concerns, and should support people who are asking questions, because better decision making comes from better information. And the more people who are involved, the more likely it is you're going to come up with the right questions and then the right answers. And the other thing, again, from afar that I'd been observing with Muskrat Falls is real concern over the frequent arrest of Indigenous community members, the land protectors. If a project is going ahead and people are being arrested, and in particular Indigenous community members are being arrested and put in jail all the time, you should be concerned. Something's not working. And I think it's also important that it's not just these days about consultation, right? But there's, self-determination, Indigenous governance, the idea of co-led projects or projects led by communities rather than being sort of imposed by outside. So there's a lot that could be said about that, about how to sort of remedy that problem. But it's an important piece, I think, of the puzzle that, again, gets some attention in the report, but perhaps could get even more.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, Boyan, for momentarily, I think we like in addition to the report, the TI report, I think folks can kind of find the work that Cole and I did through the Harris Center website at Memorial University, and that project report I think does go into some of that detail of that chilling effect of lawsuits and arrests. And I think when we've presented on Muskrat Falls before, Cole and I, we've had the comment often that it's really worth noticing that when the public inquiry happened, the kind of post-mortem of Muskrat Falls, they distinctly did not find, they bracketed out any attempt to find criminal liability. Criminal responsibility was outside the scope of the public inquiry, which means the only people that ever went to jail related to Muskrat Falls were Labrador land protectors. And I think that speaks to, in many ways, many of the points Sarah raises about, when that's the case, there may be some very serious questions to reflect on about the quality of community engagement, and particularly Indigenous community engagement, as part of leading to the project. Yeah.
We have one question about this, and I'm going to ask the panel if you are comfortable answering it, but then we'll move on because Muskrat Falls can suck time. Francois asks, the report also mentions the imbalance in expertise between the public authorities and NALCOR, which raises the issue of public investment in expertise. Do you folks have any views on that?
It's an interesting point, actually, and it was one I was just looking at something on the related to the new Impact Assessment Act, and there's new requirements that everyone who works on an Impact Assessment Act have demonstrate their expertise to the agency, and this is a new requirement under the new legislation, along with many that we can talk about. But there is a need to ensure that people who are working for proponents and for the agency and for the Environmental Assessment Office in Newfoundland have expertise and are able to make decisions and make recommendations, particularly to cabinet and ministry folks who this way may not be their area of expertise. And this has been a concern in Newfoundland and Labrador in particular. I think there's some reports that are also with the Harris Center about this often challenging relationship between ministerial staff and cabinet, and believing in the capacity of your public servants, as well as the capacity of those people who are writing the report, is not just critical for buy-in from cabinet, but also critical for the relationship that the proponent and the agency has with the public, and demonstrating that sort of public trust. So I don't know if that sufficiently answered the question, but it is, I think, a really critical component. It seems to only be for me. Nobody.
No, I apologize. I'm trying to toggle the chat, and I think when I toggle the chat off, it shifts to the recording button or something. I think that may have been my goof.
Let's move to the next case study. Cole, the largely positive story of the Voisey's Bay. Tell us a bit more about that.
I'm not going to go too much into detail because I think Voisey's Bay is an older case, but it's sort of this quintessential best practice in Canada. And it's one of those stories that, from an academic perspective, we love to pull out, and from a practitioner side, we try and emulate. It's a really interesting case also in that it was a real opportunity for conflict resolution. It was the thing that environmental assessments can be is they can be a opportunity window. They can present an opportunity window for communities, for Indigenous communities, you know, all of these potential decisions sort of coalesce often in the EA. And Voisey's became sort of an example of that. When Inco was first looking at putting a nickel mine in the Voisey's Bay area, there was a lot of distrust, a lot of pushback from Innu and Inuit communities. There was a tremendous amount of discussion about not letting this project move forward. And Inco as proponent, and also the province and the feds, sort of took this after sort of significant open conflict and took a different approach to the environmental assessment. They took a contribution to sustainability lens for the assessment framing. And this is a critical framing, not just because it changed. One thing I think that is important to understand about EA is traditionally in old impact assessment legislation and most provincial impact assessment and environmental assessment legislation, you're measuring the significant adverse effects to your local community. And that's sort of like, and so, you know, count the turtles, make sure the same number of turtles are there once your project goes in. That kind of conversation is often what happens. But when you take a contribution to sustainability, both ecological and community, which is what was the requirement under Voisey's, you flip it. You're looking for something to say, is this going to make things better? Is this going to improve my community, my world, my environment? So when the panel went through it, there were 107 recommendations that Inco was to try and fulfill. And if they went and they met all the conditions, they believed that this project would be sustainable and should go through. The most significant were that the lifespan of the project should be expanded, because mines often create boom bust sort of socioeconomic conditions. So by expanding the lifespan of the project, you expand the opportunities for well-being, and there's less sort of initial boom, big bust. It's a smaller boom, a little smaller bust, even though we know Voisey's has continued to operate and continues to be a really good source of economic prosperity in the region. And the land claim negotiations had to be met first. They had to be completed before anything could go through with the project. And again, when I say that EAs are often opportunity windows, this is the kind of thing I mean, that this was sitting since 1977, right? Sitting there waiting. You know, the province and the feds had not moved forward. This project comes forward and there becomes this major ability for the communities to say, let's get this, we need to get this done before we even talk to you about any projects. And that the impacts to specific Indigenous groups and the benefits were co-managed, and that they were reviewed before project implementation. There were specific ways in which icebreakers were to come in at certain times of the year. There was where certain things would be located, all of those things. So it really, really changed the game for impact assessment in Canada. It became this story of how EAs can create prosperity, can be not create prosperity, but create the opportunity to discuss prosperity. And so I like to talk about Voisey's. As the report discusses, gender was also considered in Voisey's, maybe not as sufficiently as we would do so now. And there's some real opportunities for growth there. Thankfully, the new legislation, one of the major aspects as well of the impact assessment legislation, and ideally in any future assessments that happen in the province exclusively, it would be great to see, is some gender related analysis, GBA plus, gender-based analysis, plus including, disaggregated demographic considerations. And that was a consideration in Voisey's. So there's some really positive things about Voisey's. And I think kind of the flip side of what Mark was talking about the small polity, that you have this opportunity because it's a small community. This project was going to influence the entirety of the community, and people worked together, even after heated conflict, and move forward together in a positive way. So that's sort of my very broad overview of a 6-year or 7-year undertaking with this EA. But
So that was in 1990.
97, well, 93, they started looking at the ore body. So 97 to 2002, 2003.
So almost 30 years. Mark, it seems not only that we don't learn anything from our mistakes, we don't seem to be willing to learn anything from the things we do well.
The rest of
No,
Canada has.
And maybe that's why we need more historians in government who are willing to go back and excavate not the good lessons and the bad, and not just rely on kind of our collective folk memories of historical grievances to help direct new mega projects, but also to have some memory of, maybe some things that were kind of that we could learn from as best practices to keep doing, right? Yeah.
And that contribution to sustainability test, I should say, is now the basis of the federal impact assessment legislation. The first line in the Impact Assessment Act is the projects, to contribute to projects or contribution to sustainability, something like that. I should be able to quote it, and that comes throughout the mandate, this measuring against sustainability, and that really emerged from Voisey's. So this is this implication that this project has had writ large over Canada. Now,
Cole, you just answered a portion of Heather McIntosh's question. I'm going to read it and let's see if we can answer the second part. The contribution to sustainability approach is interesting. A couple of questions. A, how widespread has this approach become? Thank you. And B, has that made a difference in public confidence in AEI environmental assessment overall?
So I'll give you my take, and then I would like to hear other panelists' concepts on this. So in 2018, 2019, Trudeau wrote a letter that said, we're going to have this roving panel, and the process is going to be that we're going to talk to people across Canada, Indigenous communities across Canada, and find out what's happening in impact assessment and environmental assessment. And he said, the process is to reform the legislation in order to, actually it wasn't 2019, 2017, to restore public trust in the environmental assessment process. That was the objective. This panel went across, probably many people heard about it because there was a lot of debate in the Senate after the bill was initially developed and proposed, but eventually it came into the Impact Assessment Act. It was 2019 that this bill was enacted. We are now starting to see projects go through this act, just really starting. It's just the outset. If you want to look at that, one of the other things that came out of this sort of absolute, I would say, overhaul of the Impact Assessment Act is a registry, a virtual registry. So you can go online and see very easily, if you type in Impact Assessment Agency, click registry, you can see all the projects that are there, all the documentation that's on, which is a huge change, a huge impact, because it makes the information, at least for those who have digital access, extremely accessible. And so this contribution to sustainability test, though, has been used across other places in Canada, Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, White Plains Quarry, I believe. There are other cases, but this is the first time it's sort of being demanded upon each proponent to look at. And the other major change is that the proponent is submitting information to the agency, but the agency is undertaking the review and the consultation with the community and the public, with Indigenous communities and the public, to determine the sufficiency of what the proponents are providing. So they will also be evaluating for sustainability in what is interpreted to be the public interest, right? So this is a major shift in how impact assessment is being rolled out, essentially, right? So I think that we're seeing a major shift on this conversation of contribution to sustainability. But the Impact Assessment Act for federal application is a very high bar to meet. Not that many projects will hit that requirement. Lots of major projects would. Gull Island would require an impact assessment. Nuclear projects require impact assessments, various things, but not all projects would require that federal level of review. There's thresholds that of size and capacity and all of those things.
Anybody else on the panel wants to jump in? Sarah.
Yeah, I think I agree that the contribution to sustainability aspect is hugely important, and is this shift from, you know, significant adverse environmental effects, which was really the original test. I wanted to note, and I'll put in the chat, that the Impact Assessment Agency has some information on the sustainability aspect on their website, where they identify sustainability principles. The first one being, consider the interconnectedness and interdependence of human ecological systems. The second, consider the well-being of present and future generations. The third, consider positive effects and reduce adverse effects of the designated project. And the fourth is, apply the precautionary principle and consider uncertainty and risk of irreversible harm. What I wanted to note is, of course, sustainability and sustainable development are sort of common language in a lot of things, but there's often a huge misconception about how one should approach sustainability. So there's a tendency to see it as three pillars: economy, society, and environment, and to treat them as all separate, which then can lead to conversations of, well, this project is good for jobs, therefore, and jobs trump somehow, you know, and jobs are good for society, and so that trumps environment. But you need to understand that jobs that are bad for the environment are bad for society, because they're bad for the worker. Might have a job, but it might be a job that's going to be harming their family and their community and the broader ecosystems. And so ultimately, it's also not good for the worker. So it's hugely important, I think, to take a holistic approach to understanding what sustainability means, and to avoid this economy versus environment conversation, which is a risk unless one's careful about thinking holistically.
Thank you. And you sort of answered. I'm going to read out the question we have from somebody there anonymously attending. It says, for measuring sustainability, what things we should consider, or do you have any sustainability criteria to follow? So this pretty much answers that. But if you want to add anything, please feel free.
As Sarah aptly noted, the agency does give you some methodological tips and hints. That's my practice. I'm a sustainability assessment practitioner. So I tend to try and work on objectives-based assessment. So what that means is I try and figure out what is the sustainability objective of the community and local region, and figure out then what is measurable against that. And you have to have qualitative measures under this act. It's not about quantitative statistical analysis, though that can support. But you want to say, okay, so this is what this community is looking for. So for the Voisey's Bay case, for example, you know, land claim negotiations were critical, ensuring that the community was able to maintain their traditional economic practices and not have that, you know, disrupted significantly by icebreakers. That was a critical component. So you want to figure out what those important critical components are contextually, but then you also want to think about generically, what are the larger sustainability objectives? What are climate change objectives? What are sort of regional environmental considerations about important local species or things like that? But also, you know, gender may not come up. Gender may not be something when you're talking to a local community that may be identified as a major consideration, but it should be under a sustainable current and future generations. Current generations means that there's equity within the current generation. So there are identity factors that will influence that. So thinking about those things too, it's integrating all of these concerns into one kind of assessment framework. And then a proponent has to demonstrate that their project's going to contribute to that, or at least at minimum not make things worse. And that's a really it's a really high bar, but it also shows that if it's a good project should go through. That's always what I think, and that's what I tell my clients. Good projects will go through. if it's a good project and you can demonstrate that with all of these considerations, then it should go into the community. It should impact positively. But again, it's definitely a different approach that a lot of proponents and companies are trying to struggle with understanding how to best measure sustainability, because it is new to many, many folks.
I'm going to move us forward because we have a lot to cover, although you are awesome guys. You're answering a whole bunch of questions I was saving for down the road. Simon, or maybe somebody else, there was a third study in the report, a case study in the report, and that was the study on the regional assessment of offshore oil and gas exploratory drilling. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, I can start talking about that, and I know Mark is knowledgeable about this as well, so I'll probably defer to him. But yeah, the regional assessment was for all offshore oil and gas exploratory drilling projects off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. And that was really the impetus for that assessment was that the province had kind of seen that because the province has such a strong oil and gas economy, they saw that exploratory drilling assessments, in their perspective, were had a bit of redundancy in terms of that they felt that the potential impacts of exploratory drilling had been studied so many times that the potential impacts and the mitigation measures were becoming very standard. But despite that, there was this requirement that the exploratory drilling projects had to undergo a full federal impact assessment. And so to kind of create a streamlined process for these projects, which the province expected would be ramping up with some of its plans to expand oil and gas exploratory drilling, they entered into the regional assessment, which was conducted at the federal level with the Impact Assessment Act, the new one in 2019, creating that provision to undertake regional assessments. And so I think just kind of underlying that as well, like in terms of the kind of sense of urgency behind that was, I think there was a study by the Fraser Institute that said, you know, prior to this, that 88% of managers and executives in the petroleum industry considered kind of the cost of regulatory compliance in Newfoundland and Labrador as a deterrent to investment in oil and gas projects. So that kind of frames kind of the impetus of why this was kind of conducted. And kind of the interesting things to note, I think the regional assessment, it was actually the first regional assessment to ever be conducted under the new impact assessment legislation. So kind of the implications of this process for future regional assessments is kind of important to look at for what could the implications be for how transparent these processes could be in future regional assessments. And I think what this regional assessment kind of highlighted was, I think the major kind of transparency risk was really revolved around the theme of lack of resourcing for specifically the people in charge of conducting the assessment. So the regional assessment had a regional assessment committee, and one of the things they noted in their report, I think it's like the first page, is that they complain about how they didn't have enough internal resources from all these federal government departments that said they would help them conduct the regional assessment. And yeah, it's like in the introduction where they say, we wish we had more support on the project, and like there was some like they ran into delays where they couldn't they had to ask for timeline extensions and couldn't review as much of the report as they had hoped for. And I think you see the feedback, I think you see the impacts of that lack of resourcing in the feedback surrounding the project. A few people have noted like that consultation notices were very last minute. So the panel had reached out very late to communities and Indigenous communities to be involved in public consultation events. And they also kind of critiqued that a lot of the initial reports coming from the panel were very lacked a lot of clarity and had kind of a very narrow vision that supported kind of inherently oil and gas development without kind of considering Indigenous sovereignty and things like that. And even in the reports, when the regional assessment report was being reviewed, one of the reviewers, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, which is the federal department, noted a lot of errors in the report, and even said themselves that they wish that they could have done an even more fulsome review of the report to see additional errors, but even their commenting timelines were too short to even adequately review the final report. And so I think the last kind of example of that kind of lack of resourcing again is that the panel had asked for a timeline extension to complete their review in sort of an adequate way. And the minister went on to state that he would approve the extension if on the committee's timeline, that the condition on the condition that their final report didn't interfere with industry plans to spend over $7 billion in oil and gas exploration in the region, or jeopardize a ministerial regulation that would exempt oil and gas exploratory drilling from impact assessments. And so the result of the committee's report was that, like, to allow for a ministerial regulation exempting those projects. So I think there was some kind of major transparency issues within the regional assessment, which is already sort of a sort of reduces transparency overall in the process by exempting these projects from public scrutiny. But again, I think the kind of underlying theme or cause behind sort of these transparency issues in this case were the lack of resourcing for specifically the panel who is conducting a lot of this work. But I don't know, Mark, if you have other stuff you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think less of the specifics, but I think it's good to remember the context where this was rolling out was kind of in the global oil price declines and volatility we saw kind of post 2015 or so, that kind of has turned around with the war on Ukraine. But in the years preceding that, I think you saw similar moves in other jurisdictions like the United Kingdom to streamline processes in the interests of efficiency and cost savings for the oil sector to try to maintain an exploration program, exploratory activity and production. And so I think one thing I would add is, like, I think in principle, the idea of more regional tools for policy and planning and assessment is actually a really good idea. It's not a bad idea at all, right? Like one of the weaknesses of impact assessment is that it tends to take things project by project, site by site, and very rarely look at, cumulative effects on a landscape or a seascape. So more regional thinking, I think, is profoundly a good idea. However, I think as the TI report points out, this was rolled out in a way that actually reduced transparency, reduced opportunities for meaningful engagement from communities, that kind of black boxed the process rather than implementing kind of a regional lens in a way that should, ideally, I would argue, it's like should increase meaningful engagement, increase transparency and accountability, and bring that kind of that sustainability lens, that pro-sustainability lens, to a better understanding of how projects interact with each other on a landscape or a seascape, right? So I think that's, to me, a big part of the takeaways from the regional assessment study, is not to throw out the idea of regional assessment, to say that this was really done, I think, with kind of the wrong way around, to say like that the impetus for regional assessment was, okay, how can we streamline things for development, rather than how can we also do this in a way that ensures better governance at a landscape or seascape level, right? More with
I see
more
you
rigorous governance.
nodding. Anything you want to add?
Yeah.
I totally agree. I am about to post in the chat just a link to the ECLA website where they also talk about the litigation that has sort of flowed from that. A lot of people being very concerned about that process, and it is being exactly as Mark said, backwards. And yeah, very problematic.
Yeah, I would also flag Leah Fusco at Memorial. She's been working on this as a postdoc, as well as worked very closely on the regional assessment as a study. So if you also want to go kind of a deeper dive than the TI report provides, Leah Fusco's work is also a really good resource. Yeah.
Before I move us to talking about the lessons we learn and what we can do better and what do we do actually well, I do have a question from Francois. He's asking the underlying vision of the initial report, and I'm assuming this is the report on the regional assessments, was challenged by Indigenous community members. Those conflicts of visions are frequent when we want to have a multi-perspective approach to impact assessment. How do we organize a debate on conflicting visions? What fora, processes can be used?
I don't necessarily know if you need to debate it. You just need to acknowledge there are multiple visions and multiple, and that they should be clearly and transparently identified. There's lots of projects that may end up going through and may be accepted where there's public groups that are against them or what have you. But those concerns need to be addressed, acknowledged, discussion of what mitigation measures people suggested and why not those are being undertaken, and reasoning behind the project. All those things need to be made transparently. And I think, and that's me coming from a practitioner side. But I think that's so, take that with what you may, but the fact is a lot of concerns emerge when decisions are made and there's no clear reason as to why, and how when concerns are identified and they haven't been acknowledged or they've been outright dismissed. And that's a real problem. And hopefully you can have processes where people are able to have that debate and have that dialogue, and that impact A, mitigation measures, but B, how a project proceeds, how a project is designed, all of those things. That's sort of that interplay collaboration that can happen in EA and IA that's ideal. But
can I just add, I think it's really, really important to distinguish between the processes involving local communities who are non-Indigenous, and everything Cole just said, I 100% agree with. But if it's involving Indigenous communities, there are rights very clearly recognized in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that is part of Canadian law, that is implemented Section 35, and jurisprudence that very clearly says in assessment processes, decision makers have to turn their mind to the impact on rights, which is quite different. So if you think of the Clyde River case as one example, but there's lots of them. And so I think it's absolutely crucial that is understood, that Indigenous communities are in a very different situation. Who they are and what their rights are and how that's understood is going to depend. Are you talking about historic land claims, modern land claims, land claims that are unresolved? What kind of, it's complex, but it must be centered on Indigenous rights, Indigenous governance. Co-led or Indigenous-led development is absolutely the best if you're engaged in a situation where Indigenous communities are involved. But I also want to note that too often, sometimes in Canada, it then becomes, well, Indigenous communities have all the rights and nobody else has anything. And that's not the right approach either. So whenever there's a community, absolutely sharing the information, co-developing visions, but also community-led development, or ensuring communities are really involved in the development as opposed to imposed in such a way that doesn't allow for, community sustainability ideals to lead.
Thanks for the clarification, Sarah. I was thinking of public communities. I appreciate that. One of the other points that raises, that's a really interesting point that I don't have an answer to, that is currently being grappled with in impact assessment legislation, is when communities are proponents and other when Indigenous communities are proponents, and other Indigenous communities may not support the project. And that's becoming a really live issue where, and we're seeing it particularly in Ontario in certain regions. And it's as Indigenous equity opportunities become this really powerful, I think we're not going to see impact and benefit agreements as much. We're going to see Indigenous equity ownership on a lot of projects. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the courts grapple, because I think it will come to at some point in time into our court system of what we do when Indigenous communities that are proponents and Indigenous communities that may not support a project, what happens there, and it's in their traditional territories. So again, don't have an answer for that, but it's something I think to watch for, and for Transparency International to keep an eye on, because it could be a really big issue that we're going to see in Canada.
Well, that's actually a great introduction to lessons learned part of our conversation. What do we do well in Newfoundland and Labrador that might be of interest to others and to ourselves? And what are some of the things that we should be changing? What should we all be paying attention to, and how can we do things better?
Yeah, so I can start with some of the strengths which we noted in the report around Newfoundland's process. We noticed that something interesting was that the provincial process provides specific criteria for the minister's determination of public interest. And that's actually pretty good when there's a paper by Gooday, Winter, and Westwood, which examines public interest tests across Canada, and only 46% of those actually have specific criteria for guiding that decision. So Newfoundland's kind of in the minority there for having those criteria to guide something very complicated like public interest, which can be subject to without criteria, could be an avenue for undue influence. We also noted that the provincial process has specific assessment triggers for project expansions. And we think that's really good because it introduces another opportunity to follow up on how conditions have been implemented and how monitoring has been implemented. And again, that just allows another opportunity for public scrutiny, especially into how the conditions related to environmental assessment decisions have been applied and have been complied with. And I think ultimately that encourages more monitoring and more detailed record keeping by proponents in the event that they require sort of an expansion on their project. I think another important one, which I had alluded to earlier about being able to undergo an environmental impact statement process at any time. I think that's really important, especially when if you have to undergo a whole environmental preview report and then the minister says, oh no, now you have to basically go through the same process again to do an environmental impact statement. That could be a lot of work for a proponent. And so allowing a proponent to undergo an EIS voluntarily at any time during the process, I think allows streamlining of the environmental assessment process, but also provides an opportunity to have a higher standard applied. So you're kind of increasing both the efficiency and sort of the effectiveness of the outcomes of that EA process. And I think the final thing we noted that was, I think, really important was the provisions of like proponent support throughout the province's process. Two kind of things we noted was that there's these things called industry facilitators, who are sort of dedicated people related to specific sectors. So like there's one for oil and gas, there's one for mining, and they're people within like the Ministry of Environment at the provincial level that are there to guide proponents through the EA process. So they're kind of like a touch point that helps ensure that proponents are understanding what to do within the EA process. And kind of similar to that, the proponents we had talked to as part of this research noted that there was generally very good availability of the departmental EA staff to answer proponent questions. So I think those things are really important from a proponent's perspective in terms of what transparency looks like from a proponent's lens. So yeah, I think Newfoundland is doing really, really good stuff on all those kind of fronts, which I think sets it apart from a lot of the other jurisdictions.
When your headset.
I said Mark.
Well, I think I was going to maybe just offer a few comments going from there to what lessons could we look to going forward, that I think pick up on a few themes as well. Like I think what we could do moving forward to more constructive impact assessment, and I think the one that came out of some of the discussion already that Sarah alluded to is a much better alignment with these processes with Canada's commitments under UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's one of the major high-level takeaways in the TI report. It's also one of the main recommendations and takeaways of mine and Cole's report on Muskrat Falls, is the need to just ensure these processes are much better aligned with our UNDRIP commitments. Second, I would say the other high-level takeaway in the TI report that I would just flag is ensuring more meaningful engagement through better timelines, better supports and resourcing for rights holders and stakeholders to intervene. I think that's a second really important part of how to move forward, is ensuring you don't just create these opportunities that people can't avail of, but that people actually are able to make use of those opportunities. And then the third part, kind of coming back to my first round of comments, would be the efficacy of these processes as they translate into policy and practice and decision making, so that when red flags are raised through the impact assessment process, they don't get ignored when a project is basically predetermined, right? That they do have efficacy in making decision makers pause and rethink project design and implementation, whether it's a good project or not, whether it needs to be substantively changed. So you don't end up with these kind of Muskrat Falls cases where things were largely, I think, predetermined, and the red flags raised by the impact assessment kind of become seen as a bit of a minor inconvenience to be brushed aside, right? And I think that's, I guess, the three things I would see is like UNDRIP, time and resourcing for meaningful participation, and efficacy in translating these processes into policy and practice.
Sarah and Cole, anything to add to those?
Cool.
You go
Do
first, Sarah.
first?
No, you go. You go.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with everything that's said there. I think, though, it's kind of interesting because when I hear and read the part about the support for industry in the EA process, but without parallel support for communities and others, that actually creates a greater imbalance than if the support isn't there for industry, right? So it does help industry get through the process, but it doesn't help communities figure out how to engage. So I think it's crucially important also to see the EA process as kicking in late, in a sense, right? So we see in the new federal process an earlier stage that's been added on. But I've always said that even before you get to the EA stage, companies' proponents have put a lot of work into figuring out if there's something that they want to be doing. So I just wanted to highlight that whatever the law is in the EA context, proponents, in addition to that, have responsibilities. And from an international human rights law perspective, the guiding principles on business and human rights, they have responsibilities to be paying attention to and understanding and doing human rights due diligence to figure out who might be impacted by whatever it is that they're planning to do. And to do that even before they get to the EA stage, because proponents should know well before they get to the EA whether the community is on board or not, and what the community concerns are. If it's coming up at the EA stage, it's almost late. And so I would note that the EA can only do so much, but there's a real need for all proponents to take seriously the work that needs to go in before you even get to the EA stage. And governments can support them in that as well.
Before Cole jumps in, I just want to point out to our audience that now would be a very good time to add any other questions you might have. Cole.
I love early engagement. I think it's sort of the critical crux of getting a project that's good. Good. I think that's that to me, that's, you know, in the report, there's also recommendations for implementing, and I think this goes to what Sarah was just saying, participant and capacity funding for the public and for Indigenous communities in a significant way, because it's much harder for the public and for community members and for Indigenous governments and all of these groups to participate in a way when you almost have the deck stacked, right? You have a lot of people who are professionals working definitely for proponents, and it can feel very, very overwhelming to try and get into that process. I've worked with communities that have said to me, I don't even know where to start, right? So that assistance is really critical. And the other component that is in the report that I want to acknowledge is that GBA Plus should be part of Newfoundland and Labrador's analysis going forward, because it's also not just about gender. It's about, as we said, implementing free, prior, and informed consent, but thinking about all of those different considerations that may influence the equity implications of a project. And those GBA analysis can have a lot of important implications. So I really want to encourage that for Newfoundland and Labrador to consider. It's again a new process, and we're going to see it, I think, be a little bit rocky in its first interpretations for the feds. Especially, I will say, many people who do impact assessment are male engineers. So it'll take a little while for there to be a shift. And that's one of the great things that the agency federally is providing is a lot of support on how to do that. And I think that if you did any of these shifts, the ministry at the provincial level would have to provide a lot more support to both proponents and the community members and Indigenous governments on how to participate effectively.
So for the last 5 minutes or so, I want each of you to reflect on the conversation, but I specifically want you to reflect on this importance of transparency in the whole process. We talked about it right at the beginning, and I would like to close with that because I think that notion of transparency is really important in all of these processes, both federal, provincial, and really on any level. So who wants to start? Mark? Go.
Sure, yeah. Maybe I'll just call back to the Muskrat Falls case, because I think it was a very clear case where so many of the issues through that process were about informality and untransparent communication across ministries, between Nalcor and the government, proponents in government, poor communication to publics, various publics, poor communication to Indigenous communities and with Indigenous communities. So I think transparency is a theme that really runs throughout a lot of the governance failures that have left us with, again, a project that the public inquiry has labeled as a boondoggle, you know, with years over budget, billions of dollars over budget, years behind schedule, a lot of animosity and opposition from communities, from Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. So I think you just see that from that case study in particular, so many of the governance failures along the way that led to this boondoggle were related to a lack of transparency. So.
Sarah?
I would say absolutely transparency is central to a rights-based approach to these kind of projects. And I would note a couple of other things. I mean, I guess one can think of transparency at each sort of along the way of the project development, right? Like it starts in the very early stages once there's an idea and it carries all the way through. But then you also have to enable people to, support people to actually understand what is being communicated. If information is being communicated, that might mean different languages that it needs to be in. If we're thinking Inuit, for example, and participant funding and all those other kind of things. But then once we get to the end of the process, and I think this is in the report as well, it's really important for there to be published decision statements. And the published decision statements should reflect back on all of the information that has been provided, and then show that a very informed, balanced decision has been made that has really considered the information before the decision maker. That's real transparency. If you can't even access the decision and there are no reasons that make any sense, then how can the public trust the result?
Thank you. Cole and then Simon.
I don't think I have much to add. I think we've talked quite significantly about this concept, and I think that Mark and Sarah's points are extremely well taken. Primarily, when I'm drafting an IA or an EA, I think, can my neighbor understand what I'm writing and what I'm saying? And I think we have to have that throughout for each party in this process. And we have a responsibility to try and make this process as accessible to the public and to Indigenous communities as possible. And sometimes that can be really challenging with hyper-technical documentation and things like that. But I think that this is what also we need to talk about with transparency of information, ease and access of that information on all of those things. So I appreciate that this conversation is happening in Newfoundland and Labrador. And I think that when we have these conversations in Ontario and the Yukon and other communities, it also brought to light some very different issues, and some much more severe than what we're talking about here, actually. If just to be honest, if you want to go through the Ontario report, you Newfoundlander and Labradorians will feel much better. But it is a really, really critical conversation that we're having. So thanks for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you. Mark, 10 seconds before I go to Simon.
Yes, just wanted to jump in and say, riffing on Cole's comments, I think if there is good quality transparency, you're not going to find 100% consensus on a project most of the time. So if you're an opponent, if there's good transparency, you should still be able to feel that the process was just and equitable and be able to understand a decision even if you don't agree with it.
Simon.
Yeah, I think I would just echo what everyone else has said, and maybe jumping off of what Mark just said, I think that I think we've stressed that it's important that that opportunities for engagement and stuff have real outcomes. But I think as well, just like if we also think about the opportunities, I think one thing we also noted was the strength in Newfoundland is they have really long commenting timelines compared to other jurisdictions. It's like Newfoundland is like 35 days, while most other jurisdictions are 30 days. But even then, there's issues with people. That's one of the main issues we ran into, people saying that just wasn't sufficient with all the technical and legal information. And so I think that kind of brings into a broader discussion, maybe nationally, about like, how do we structure commenting and public engagement in a way that's more efficient and but also still effective. So I think I would just add that as the last kind of part.
Thank you very much. Noah, any questions that I'm not seeing?
No, I think that's it. That's all I see. But let's give last chance if anyone wants to chime in with a question.
Well, while we are waiting, I certainly want to thank all of you who attended. You've been a great audience with some really great questions. And panel, this is really complicated and difficult and complex and not simple at all. And you've been great. You really dived into a lot of complicated things here. And thank you so much for that. Noah, why don't you take this to the conclusion?
Okay, well, just to follow on that, Boyan, thank you very much for moderating this panel, and thank you for the panelists for all your interventions. I think that was a really great conversation. Thank you to everyone who attended and participated. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Please do visit our website. The report is available online. I've also put it in the chat. And please do remain involved with TI Canada and follow our work. This is one of many reports that we've produced. but we'd really love to see more people from Newfoundland and Labrador engaged with TI Canada. So thank you again, and that concludes today's webinar.